Today we are going to talk about how to double your net worth, not just once, but over and over again. The purpose of this is to help with making sure that you're on track with your goals, or if you aren't, to see what you need to do in order to get there. It is also a form of retirement planning, starting at the end point and working your way back. The reason why we look at doubling is because it's exponential. You may have already heard of the Emperor's chessboard story, which shows the power of exponential growth. According to legend, a Chinese emperor asked a sage what he would want in order for a service, and the sage said his price, nothing more than some rice, 2 grains on the first square of a chessboard, 4 on the second, 8 on the third, and so on and so on. On first glance, this doesn't seem too difficult. However, when we look at the logical conclusion of this, by halfway through the chessboard at 32 squares, we're already over 2 billion grains of rice on a single square, and by the end at 64 squares, over 9 quintillion grains of rice, which just goes to show that even though you may start with just 1 or 2, it doesn't take long for this thing to snowball and grow. So, this exercise that I'm about to show you was inspired by both the exponential growth and also a video clip which said that if you grow at just 12% per year, you will double every 6 years. I have decided to expand on this and to create a model of what this looks like in reality, where we can also look at the best case and worst case scenarios. So let me talk you through it. We're going to start here on the left hand side, where we can play with the percentage amount that we will grow each year and then see based on that how long it will take to double our net worth. Now obviously if we don't have any growth at all, we're going to start at 1 and we're going to finish at 1 no matter what happens. However, obviously, if we add 100% per year, we're going to double every single year. But that's not really realistic. So this exercise is about finding out what a realistic expectation is of how many times you're going to be able to double your money through your working career or your lifespan. I've already gone ahead and done some work here, which shows how long it takes to double your money based on the annual increase percentage. Now, it's highly unlikely that anyone is going to be adding to their net worth 40%, 100% per year on a consistent basis throughout their entire career. So we're going to use this to try and find what might be reasonable for us. And this will vary based on person to person, their career growth, their income growth, their sources of income. And it's not going to be linear throughout their life. So this model doesn't account for, big jumps of promotions, etc. But we can still give ourselves a good idea of where we might end up. For most people, you're probably looking at somewhere between the second half of this, which is around the 7 to 13 years per cycle to double your money. So a growth of 5.5% of your net worth here and 10.4 up here. Now, I'm referring to this as a cycle. So every doubling period I am calling one cycle. So then based on this, and we need to work out how many cycles we're going to be able to go through within our working career. So for example, if we're basing this off of someone that's just entered the market, the workforce, we're going to assume that, let's say they maybe even want to retire early, so they might work from the age of 20 to the age of 50. So in here, we're going to have 30 years for them to accrue their net worth and grow that. So now we need to work out how often their net worth is going to double. And what they also start with is very important. So let's say they started and they had a small inheritance. Let's say it's £10,000. Now we can already see this populates our graphs down here. On one side they're basically the same graph, but on one side I've got it for 6 cycles and on the other 12. Because if you just looked at 12, you might think that nothing happens between 0 and 6 cycles because of the exponential nature. But it's all relative, and if we zoom in and we only double for 6 cycles, you can see that this is still exponential. So now in our model to track what we need, we're going to look at both what we start with, being our net worth. So in year 1, we are starting with £10,000. In this box, we can assume an asset growth of any percentage, and we can look at the average, we can look at best case, worst case. A lot of finance influencers will like to make models based on a 12% annual return because it makes all the numbers a lot bigger and looks better. If you're going to be a pessimist, you might say more around 5%. And if you're going to be realistic, it's probably around 8% average per year that assets will grow at, probably even somewhere between 5 and 8, but maybe not consistently over 12. So here we're going to assume a reasonable growth percentage of the assets that we currently have. So we're assuming that this £10,000 is invested in either stocks and shares, in ISAs, in pension. We're including everything in this, in property, anything that is an asset that will grow in value over time. And then what we need to look at every year is what they're going to be adding into this pot. So let's say they start out and their salary is £25,000, and of that about 20% will be taxed and taken out in deductions. So they'll probably take home about £20,000. Let's say that it's £1,000 a month for rent, which brings them to £12,000 for the year. And then we add everything else on top for the cost of living. They're probably spending upwards of £16,000 a year in total for their cost of living, including accommodation. So let's say we have £4,000 left over that we can do something with. But maybe we allow for another holiday or something like that, and we take it down to £3,000 per year. So in the first year, this £3,000 and an 8% growth of the current 10%, £10,000, will give us 38% in our first year growth of compared to what we had. And if we were to look at this and keep it up, we'd be doubling our money every couple of years. But what we can see here is that the growth slows down over time because the amount that you're adding in has less of an impact compared to what you already have. Also, forgotten to mention here, we can add in the expected percentage growth. So what you might expect through your pay slips and promotions and average this across. So in a normal, if you're working in this job on minimum wage, maybe we're expecting 2% increase per year, which will then update the rest of the table so that our added amount per year is larger. But this is currently below inflation. And let's say that we're accounting for the fact that we're going to jump up in our career and every few years we're going to receive a promotion and go from £25,000 a year to 30, 35, 40. So let's assume that in general, our growth per year accounting for that is actually more like, let's say 8% per year. But we can still see that as time goes on, the amount that we are contributing and adding into our net worth becomes less and less. However, each year, the drop in percentage of growth is less because even though we are not being able to keep up in terms of the amount added, the asset growth ends up overtaking what you can put in anyway. As we can see up here, 8% of 10,000 would be £800, but we are putting in 3,000, and so that's much more of a substantial addition here, which is 30% compared to the 8%, making up the 38. Down here, with a net worth of around 100,000, 8% will be growing £8,000, and 7,500 is about 8% too. So we can see now that we're at the point where the asset growth will overtake what we are adding in. So this is important to note too. However, being able to top up the asset growth with additional income is what's going to try and keep us in these higher percentages and allow us to go through more cycles before we end up leaving the workforce. So, looking at these numbers, we start at 38, we end at 15% growth per year. So now we're going to look at where that sits in our time to double. So if we average, and we know that this is going down every time each year, let's say that then on average we're probably going to end up with a rate of total growth of maybe 10% by the time we finish our working career, and so that's 7 years every time to double. So if we're only working for 30 years, we start with £10,000, we're having these additions, and every 7 years we're going to have a doubling of our net worth. We are going to go through 4.29 cycles of growth. Now, if we look at our net worth chart and we look at our starting net worth of 10,000, taking into account all of this and going through 4.3 cycles, we're going to end somewhere between £80,000 and £160,000. Most likely this will be about 100 to 120,000 is where we end up. And this should send some alarm bells ringing that if we're in this position and we start with 10,000, 8% growth, and we add £3,000 a year, which grows at 8%, we're not going to have enough by the time we retire, or at least we're not going to have enough by the time we want to retire early. So now let's look at this. Okay, we're in the situation, we've realised that we can't retire early, but what we can do is we can work until the state pension retirement age, which we'll assume will be 65, although that is not going to be the case. But for simple numbers, that adds another 15 years to our working life, which now brings us up, and we can go through 2 more cycles, bringing us to 6.43. Now this brings us somewhere to more around the 500,000 mark, which is a lot better than the 120,000. And what you'll notice, and this is part of the reason why a lot of people will not retire even if they can, is because note that at each stage, the amount that you gain from going through one more cycle equals the same as you've made for your entire work history. Now in cycle 2, let's say you were doing 7-year cycles, you've gone through, well, you're starting here, so 2 is actually going through one cycle, but you've spent 7 years working to double your net worth. Now the interesting thing here is that doesn't sound too bad. Okay, in 7 years I doubled my net worth, and it's worth the 7 that were before it. However, once we get further down here, let's say we got to our 6th cycle, which has taken us 7 times 5 years or so. So we're talking, it's taken us 35 years to get to this point. But if I just work another 7 years, I will make the same as I worked in the previous 35. And then from there, if I work another 7 years, I will make the same as I made in the previous 42. So this is where you can be trapped, and it's where you need to decide your values and what you want out of life. Is it worth working for more, or would you rather stop early and know that you haven't made your absolute maximum potential, but then you're buying back those years of life? And I guess it comes down to what that means to you. Now to just go over another example, which is my personal situation, and you can see this from my current net worth tracker video series, is that my current net worth as it stands is £200,000 thereabouts. So we're going to enter this in our editable boxes. We can still assume this 8% growth and hope that that will be the case. And each year I have about the amount, I'm on a £110,000 salary, and at the end of each year, when you look at the amount of spare money I have that I could have put into investments and savings and assets, we're coming to about £32,000. And at this point in my career, I'm not going to necessarily be having a pay growth which is the same as it was in my early career, and so we're looking at potentially more like we'll be modest and we'll say a 3% pay growth, although I do expect some more promotions, so this should be bumped up in reality. I am currently 25, and I'm a few years older, but for the simplicity of maths, I am 25. And again, we'll go back to an early retirement scenario. I do not want to work past 50, so I would have another 25 years left. Now looking at these percentages of the growth, we start at 24% growth of our net worth in the first year. We're down to about 11, 12 by the time we reach our 13th year. And so we're going to be looking, again averaging out, let's say we reach an annual increase after we extrapolate this out of 10%. And so then what we're going to have is 7 years to double, which means that 25 over 7 is 3.57. So at this rate, I would be able to retire again between the third and fourth cycle, halfway through. So we're talking just over £1 million, which technically it could be enough to stretch to an early retirement, but ideally we would have more like 2 million to retire, most likely by that time. So then what we can do is we can again say that, well, if I really need to work until the end of my working career when I can, we're going to be looking at 40 years of working life and 5.7 cycles. So actually we're going to end up much closer to around the 5 million mark, and this would definitely be enough. And this would give me confidence that I am on the right track, and that even if my scenario did not improve from my current job, if I stayed working my current job with a 3% annual growth, I would actually end up in a very reasonable position. Now in reality, I know that this is going to jump a lot more. After the first or second year, I'm planning to pay off my student loan, which will mean that I can add an extra £7,000 a year to my net worth, as that's what's currently deducted from my paycheck. I also know that then if I slam into my mortgage and pay that off as soon as possible, that will be paid off by about year 9, which will then give me an extra £16,000 per year, which I can put into other things. So between the £7,000 and the £16,000, that's an extra £23,000 that I would have somewhere around here. So if we were to factor that in from this point onwards and say that this was £63,000, taking that into account, we see we raise our percentage up closer to 13, 14, and now our cycles would be every 5-6 years. So we're going to say, let's say best case scenario, and we end up getting higher pay jumps and promotions throughout this of 8%. Definitely 14 then we're saying that we can manage. So we're going with about 5.5 years. 8 cycles is what we can get. And in this scenario, more looking at a best case and being an optimist of what we could have, I could even work for 8 cycles and get £25 million. And here we can see the real power of the difference in what you add, how much it grows, and how much your assets grow. Also, again, looking back at early retirement and looking at another 25 years, which I have left till 50, it would be 5 cycles, 3.2 million in net worth. That's definitely enough to have a house paid off and investments to live off until I retire. So in this scenario, I'm very comfortable and very happy with what I've got. Again, this is not a perfect model, but it allows us to see if we're in the right ballpark and if things will pan out differently, looking at a best case and worst case scenario. And as we can see from these graphs, there is massive power in compound growth and interest. You could also use this not just to look at net worth, but imagine this simply being your investments. You can do the exact same numbers and do this as, for example, tracking your ISA portfolio and projecting out what that would be worth. Again, it comes back to personal choices, how long you want to live for, how long you want to work for, and how many times you think you're going to double your money within that period. And this is just a good way to give you peace of mind. Let me know what you think and what you're aiming for. How many cycles are you going for? How many times are you going to double your money? Are you looking at early retirement or maxing out how much you make by keeping on going until you then get the state pension? Let me know in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.